Welcome to the 2015 WID Report. I'm Kat Zigmont, the Global Initiative Assistant Director at the World Institute on Disability.
And I'm Thomas Foley, Deputy Director of WID.
This session is on WID's research findings from WID-initiated focus groups, surveys, and topics of interest to the disability community. We're going to start with grit. Tom, why are you interested in grit?
Well, Kat. So actually, we are researching the topic of grit, and Kat's going to talk a little bit about our first study outcome on that. But really, we're studying this topic. You know, it came out of the defense industry, actually, and it was research trying to figure out why some people succeed and other people do not. And we thought that this might have great applicability to the disability community. I think the age-old question is, why do some people with disabilities, build a career, build a financial future, have a family, et cetera, and someone else with exactly the same sort of situation, do not do as well? As a graduate of UC Berkeley, I refer to this as how come some people got lives and some people my age are still smoking pot. So, frankly, one of the things we're trying to figure out is what those differences are. Can we track them? Are they predictive? And can they be taught?
Yeah. So grit, as defined by Angela Duckworth, is the tendency to sustain interest in an effort toward very long-term goals. A unique scale measuring one's grit from 1 to 5 was developed by Duckworth Labs, in an attempt to assess one's grittiness. So we took this scale and then we added some additional factors. For example, what level of educational attainment did their parents receive? What are these students on SSI or SSDI for financial aid, et cetera. So far, we began this in August of 2015. We have 40 college students and college graduates with disabilities. And our preliminary results are showing that over 70% of respondents were incredibly gritty, scoring 3.5 or higher on the grit scale. Among these respondents, over half of them are currently on SSI or SSDI, and they've used it for financial aid to afford tuition, housing, and other costs while pursuing a degree. Among the 30% of respondents who are not very gritty, only 1/3 of these individuals have utilized need-based financial aid. However, income was not the greatest factor between those who have high or low grit. Parental and guardian education levels stood out so far as the highest possible influence of those who have high grit. Over 80% of the very gritty individuals come from households where their parents or guardians hold an undergraduate or graduate level degree, while only about 37% of low grit individuals have parents or guardians with undergraduate or graduate degrees. One other significant difference between the high and low grit scores was self-admitted personal characteristics, right? So these are the questions about grittiness. Specifically, only 87% of high grit individuals are self-admitted hard workers, and only 25% of those with low grit are self-admitted hard workers. Additionally, a mere 25% of low grit individuals were admittedly diligent, while over 70% of high grit individuals are admittedly diligent. So what we're seeing so far is the parents' education will sort of shape how gritty their child with a disability is. Tom, would you like to talk a little bit about our financial focus groups?
Excellent, great. So switching gears on you a little bit here. So we're going to, one of the things that we're very interested in WID, as you may have guessed, is access to financial services, financial success, asset building, all those sorts of things. So we have a program looking at the accessibility of financial and banking services for folks with disabilities. So I just want to take a couple of minutes and talk a little bit about two studies that we're in the middle of. One is looking at folks who are deaf and have hearing loss and access to financial services, and the second one is folks with physical disabilities who and barriers to access to financial services. And it gets kind of confusing to talk about them together, so I'm going to start off with deaf and hearing loss. So it will probably come as no surprise to any of you in the room that if you have a significant hearing loss or if you're deaf, it's really hard to hear through bulletproof glass. You know, not a big surprise here. But you know what has been a big surprise, and I'm getting a little ahead of myself. So this is based on a series of 8 focus groups that we did. We did 2 here, we did 2 in D.C., and we did 4 in St. Louis at a major hearing loss conference. So obviously, if you don't hear very well, it's kind of hard to hear through bulletproof glass. But a couple of the other factors that came out in and around this were a surprise to us. So the tinting on the bulletproof glass makes it more difficult for people to read lips. Instructions to bank tellers to please speak more clearly and more slowly, almost without exception, do not sort of get responded to in a positive way. You know, one of my favorite pieces of feedback from one of our deaf focus group participants was she dreads going into the bank because the person behind the counter is going to use their 1 semester of ASL and try to communicate through finger spelling. And she said, you know, I'm not going to the bank to help you with your finger spelling in ASL. So that was a significant issue. Another issue that was highlighted obviously was customer service over the phone. Lots of folks with hearing loss highlighted this as a major issue, not only telephone trees, for example, automated telephone trees that are hard to hear, but also one-on-one customer service, particularly when that customer service is offshored and there are accents that just make it a lot harder for folks with hearing loss and deafness. So in addition to this, we also, you know, several of these issues also came up when it came to, you know, financial advising staff inside the bank. People have privacy concerns when people are talking really loud about their personal finances. Nobody likes that, obviously. So one of the other things that we were talking about in these focus groups are, you know, but what is working for people? At the same time, what is working? And probably not come as a big surprise to folks. A lot of folks who are deaf and have hearing loss love the ability to do their online banking. Online banking works super well for folks with hearing loss and deafness, as does mobile banking and the ATMs as well. A couple of other things that we ran into that were pretty interesting. Educational videos on bank and financial institution websites obviously need to be captioned. Some people do a really good job of that. Some people don't do such a good job of that. And then a couple of things came up that were interesting historical myths. So particularly in the deaf community, there was current present-day reports of banks not being willing to accept VRI calls, video relay calls. So we know that this was a problem, you know, 4, 5, 6 years ago, but what we had heard is a lot of banks had really taken this on. So we did some digging. And we checked with the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau about complaints about this sort of thing that all virtually have evaporated as far as 3 years ago. We talked with a couple of financial institutions that we have a good relationship with. Those sort of disappeared. But the other thing that we did that was kind of interesting to us anyways, we talked with the VRI operators who said, you know, that the banks really have not, this has just not been an issue from the VIR operator standpoint for the last couple of years. So what it really highlighted to us is that there's sort of this, this memory of this denial of service that is still sort of affecting people's opinions and reputations of the financial services with which they work. So we obviously highlighted a couple of issues that that banks can work on. But one of the things we also asked, the closing questions we asked were, give us the 3 most important things that a bank could do for you right now to be more accessible, or a financial institution, right? So a couple of things came up, particularly in this community. So number 1 was online text chat. And I was surprised to learn we're putting together a little report card for the top 10 banks or so around all these issues. But I was surprised to learn that a number of financial institutions don't offer online, text chat for customer service. A number of them do, and several don't. We were actually talking to one bank the other day, and they were saying, it would be quite a security issue for them. And so we had to explain that, really what we're talking about is something that would be behind their firewall on their website, where somebody who is deaf or hard of hearing could just type in their question rather than picking up the phone or hitting a talk to me button. Again, about half the banks that we've looked at offer this service, and some others are beginning to look at it. It's interesting. One of the things that we are really trying to do is partner with business to make things more accessible and sort of understand, where they're coming from as well. And I was talking to this one bank who was saying, banks obviously, and for very good reason, not only from a regulatory standpoint, but just from a customer service standpoint, really worry about security. And they were talking about having a link on their homepage for when a customer had any sort of accessibility concerns. And the problem that they've run into is the person clicks on the link, and it's an email, right? You send an email, and people are including their account numbers with their social security numbers, and then just sending an email off through the web. This is the sort of thing that just really concerns the banks. So anyway, the number 1 was texting, the ability to text to talk to their bank through the website. Another thing that came up was a hearing loop system in the bank. I mean, how difficult would it be to put in a hearing loop system at least, one of the windows in the bank? So we've also found that there are a couple of banks that are doing this, a couple of other financial institutions, kind of investment houses that are doing this. What's really interesting is even the banks that are doing it, a lot of the senior management doesn't know that they're doing it. So, it's like, you're doing a great job on the hearing loop system. And they're like, we're doing a great job on the what now? It's heartening to see that the loop systems are being installed in certain banks. One of the suggestions we had was for another issue that came up in the deaf community. For people who are deaf and they come into the bank and they need to do something, you can sort of do notes, but kind of notes doesn't work so well, and sometimes the tellers just aren't tracking on it. So one of the things that we were asked to investigate was to install a video relay system in a bank. So this would be, perhaps an iPad at one of the windows that was hooked up to either an internal VRI system, or it could probably contract with a VRI system. So this is something else that financial institutions are looking for, because at the moment we can still be a 3 to 5 day delay for the bank to be able to actually get a sign language interpreter for somebody to come in and be able to do their business. So there are a couple of other, things that we've looked at. We've looked at, how mobile banking might be able to alleviate some of these issues. And again, we're working with the financial industry to kind of, move forward on all these initiatives to make banking a little more accessible for folks who are deaf and hearing impaired. Let me just touch very quickly on some of the stuff we found in the physical disability community, because we were surprised, and there were a lot of differences. So there still remain certain issues around physical access for folks with disabilities. ATMs, while perhaps technically and legally accessible, are still not the most accessible things in the world for folks with physical disabilities. That might be a matter of being able to get a chair under an ATM. It might be the physicality or dexterity to put a card in, get a card out, put the cash in, take the cash out. And so those are a number of issues that folks have run into. the ability to navigate through a bank branch, the number of accessible parking, automatic doors, super overly helpful security guards are all things that were sort of highlighted by folks with physical disabilities. From a customer service standpoint, were things such as, so people come in, they go to the accessible window, and perhaps someone, the person at the teller, is somewhat resistant to closing down their machine and moving to the window. The other issue that came up is sometimes folks go to the more accessible window, and yet maybe they were second in line when they came into the bank, but people don't move down to the accessible window to provide service until the entire line of 5 or 6 people has passed. We ran into a couple of other things, too. One of the things we wanted to look at was the unbanked piece. And particularly in the physical disability side of the house, we found a higher percentage of folks who were unbanked. The FDIC says that 28% of the disability market is unbanked. We think that tends to trend more toward the IDD community. We were finding about 10% in hearing loss and about 15 to 20% in physical disability. But one of the things that really surprised us is that we were talking with a number of younger people, and I'm putting this somewhere between like 18 and 25, many of whom had college degrees or graduate degrees, but they still did not have their own bank account. They had a joint account with a parent, and often, the parent did the banking for them. So I think, there might be an interesting piece to look at there, going forward. Another piece that was really interesting on the unbanked side is a number of people with the physical disabilities said that they didn't think banks would be interested in them because of their low income status. And even it was really interesting because even when we pointed out, a deposit of a benefit check or an unemployment check or something like that could yield a bank account with, free bill pay and no annual fee, there was still an awful lot of resistance to the idea. When we asked, in addition to asking the question, what are the 2 or 3 things that a bank could do to make it more accessible to you? In both communities, so the hearing impaired community said, you know what, if you could put text on, if I could communicate with my bank through text chat, and you put a hearing loop in the branch, and there was a video relay system, and you directly marketed to me, 85% of those people in that focus group said they would change banks. So that's a pretty significant percentage if you think about it, because changing banks is no mean feat. Now that's just people saying that they're going to do it. It doesn't mean that they will, but they're certainly open to it, and they're certainly open to being marketed to. And particularly in the hearing loss community, where that tends to be something that happens later in life, we're looking at pretty well-resourced people that represent a new market opportunity. Also in the physical disability side of the house, same thing. If you make it more accessible to me, if people have better customer service skills, if I'm sort of treated like everybody else, if I have access to the ATM machines, I'll add to that in physical disability. Folks want some assistance around benefit planning by their banks, and they also want financial education through their banks. They also said that they'd be willing to change banks or financial institutions if they met their access needs. Probably not a surprise to anyone in this room, but it's been a surprise to some of the people with whom we partner. So just again, to sort of cover that, access is not just the right thing to do, but it's good business and it's good for the bottom line. We are about to release a national survey in both those communities, so everybody in the room, please keep an eye out for that. Our GRIT work is also going to be continuing with a number of other studies looking at assets and employment outcomes, so please keep a lookout for that. But with precisely 5 minutes to go, want to thank you again for the opportunity to talk to you about some of our research that we're doing and will be doing going forward, and we would be delighted to take questions at this point. Thanks a lot.
A question about grit.
Oh,
Yes.
sure.
Is there any of that research that related to cultural and linguistic diversity?
Ooh, not that we've seen. Again, it's fairly recent stuff. It's 5-6 years old at this point, and unfortunately, a bunch of it's still classified because it's mostly DoD funding.
Interesting.
Tom, I wondered if your banking study distinguished between banks and credit unions.
Yes, in two ways. So the survey that should be going out next week breaks that down. And we also, so the 15% of people who would not move their bank account were credit union people.
Tom, folks on federal disability benefits have to have a bank account these days to have the government direct deposit their check into something. Did anything come up about those connections in your work?
They did. So, in fact, in both communities. So, thanks to Heather, actually, I talked to some folks in Chicago from the deaf community who are actually using the stored value card. So they're still avoiding banks and credit unions, and they're using the SSI stored value card, and they seem to have very little interest in changing that up. Of course, when a check comes along, they wind up at a payday lender and get charged $30-40 to cash a check. So that is a total suboptimal outcome from our perspective. But people, there's some interesting stuff going around that. We also, in the physical disability community, we also ran into some folks, and we're still trying to sort this out, who were receiving benefits but didn't have a stored value card and didn't have a traditional checking account. We're not sure what that means yet. That's what I thought too, but I'm unclear on the type of benefit. So again, the survey, it gets a lot more into depth. In a focus group setting, people are sometimes a little more hesitant to get into their own situations so much. So I think the survey goes a lot more into depth around some of those subgroups.
Paul.
I want to ask a question about the survey in a second, but just to dig in the dirt for a second on the grit stuff. Aren't people also spending a lot of time now talking about perseverance and ability to face challenges? And it seems like there's a lot of research popping up on that being a key area of success, indicator of success for people who are disabled or not, are able to survive and continue and thrive. Has that come up in your...
It has. It's very similar and related area. I think another term for grit would be perseverance or adherence. And I think some of that work has spun out from Duckworth's work, but it seems like she was the first person to put a scale together that's been proven to have a certain amount of predictive veracity.
The survey you're going to do, is it web-based?
Yes.
And how are you going to, what are you going to do about trying to deal with the rigor of that and determining whether you've got a sufficient sample and things of that sort? So
we're doing it in a couple of ways. We're putting it out through a number of partners, so April, Nickel, HLAA, and then those member organizations who have a pretty good network are also going to try to administer it to interested participants in person to the extent that that's doable.
It'll be fascinating to see. We did a phone survey, as I think you know, on some of these same topics, and it'll be one of the things I was worried about is when you start asking people about financial and topics that they'll clam up and you'll lose your survey, and it'll be interesting to see if you get a lot of takers, if people are comfortable, especially if they're doing it online, and how much they'll want to tell you about anything relating to their financial practices.
You know, it's so interesting, and that's one of the reasons we went with the online. We get that that's going to trend in a certain direction, but we think there might be more honesty and willingness because it's so anonymous. And you know, it's interesting. We also did. We're in year 2, and we just don't have the data in so much yet, of a broadband access study here in California that we did by phone. And from year 1 to year 2, and we're incentivizing these guys too. We're paying them, is it $100?
Yeah.
$100 to participate. We lost 35% of our group who have changed their numbers or lost their numbers or whatever, even though we're paying them $100 to stay in touch with us.
Wow.
So that was a tough decision, to figure out how we would do it. But so we went with the online and hopefully in person through our partners.
Thanks.